I've decided in this video to present a short philosophical argument for universalism, otherwise known as universal restoration or apokatastasis. This is the view that ultimately all people will be reconciled to God in Jesus Christ, whether in this life or in the next life, after a period of restorative judgment. Now, there are many arguments to be a universalist. There are philosophical arguments, which is the one I'll consider here. There are theological arguments, there are biblical arguments, but I just want to consider this one argument in this short video. I don't claim to be original in this. I'm sure other people have thought about the same thing and probably articulated it much better than I'm going to do here. But be that as it may, let's take a look at the argument. So it begins in the first premise with a definition of God. And the definition of God comes famously from Anselm's ontological argument. It's important to appreciate that I'm not appealing here to any kind of ontological argument. I'm simply invoking the definition of God. So God here is defined as that being than which none greater can be conceived. So God is going to transcend any of our concepts of God. If we have a concept of God uh, that is greater than God, well, that's impossible. You can't do that by definition. God will transcend all of our concepts. I think this is a pretty intuitive definition. It's certainly one I'm going to accept for the sake of this argument, and I'm not going to bother to defend it. So then we go to the second premise. Any being who is greater than which none can be conceived will actualize a creation with a final state greater than which none can be conceived. Now, this is not stated perfectly. I want to clarify here. I'm not claiming that any being who is greater than which none can be conceived will necessarily create. I'm not claiming that. What I am claiming is, insofar as that being does create, the creation it produces will have a final state which is greater than any final state that can be conceived by a human creature. Therefore, it follows that any creation God actualizes, God being that being who's greater than none which can be conceived, that any creation which God actualizes will have a final state greater than which none can be conceived. I'm going to just go give you the last premise and then the conclusion, and then we'll kind of unpack it from there. Maybe help to just see everything together. So then we go to premise four: a creation with a final state in which all creatures are ultimately reconciled to God is greater than a creation in which some creatures suffer eternally or some creatures are destroyed. So what this is saying here is the final state in which universalism is true is greater than a final state in which a subset of creatures are either annihilated or are subjected to eternal conscious torment. The reconciliation scenario, ultimate restoration scenario, is better than those other two alternatives. But then from that, it follows that any creation God actualizes will include a final state in which all creatures are ultimately reconciled to God. So that's the argument. Now, one thing to clarify here, the argument does not claim that either God or the final state, it's not denying that the actual God or final state can be conceived. In fact, you can conceive God to the extent that you have the description here, and you can conceive of the final state, the description that you talk about it as the ultimate restoration of all creatures. What it is saying is that any alternative, which is not as great as that, will by definition be excluded. So any account of the final state in which some creatures are annihilated or some creatures are subjected to eternal conscious torment is just excluded a priori, because God would surely create the creation that we can envision in which all creatures are ultimately reconciled to God. Okay, now the expected responses. The Arminian response would approximately go like this. Well, you might say that something may be conceivable but not feasible. And it may be conceivable for God to actualize a creation in which all libertarian free creatures are freely reconciled to him, then maybe that's not feasible because of such a concept as transworld depravity that C.S. Lewis, that Alvin Plantinga famously talked about. So that would be the objection from an Arminian. And the rejection from a Calvinist, I would think, would be that our intuitions as to which world is greater are flawed. So the non-universalist Calvinist would argue, contrary to what we think, that in fact the annihilationist or eternal conscious torment outcome is greater because it more fully magnifies God's glory. And there's a whole theological argument that goes into that. And for the purposes of this video, I'll just say that if you're unpersuaded by those responses, then I think the argument can be sustained. And the last thing I want to say here is simply this. I do think that there are many people that are compelled by universalism because of that intuition, which is rather clumsily summarized by me here. And that intuition is that there is something about universalism that is just a greater possible scenario. It is the greatest possible scenario where all creatures are ultimately restored and reconciled to God. So, ought we to believe that is true? Well, if God is that being who's greater than we can conceive, then presumably this outcome would be as well. So, we ought, in fact, believe that it is the case. One footnote before I conclude. There will be probably some people who say, well, doesn't this argument entail that God should create a creation in which there's no suffering at all? And I'm going to concede that there are some people who could argue in that way, in which case this could be an argument for atheism, interestingly. I will say it does seem to me that I think the theodicies, like a greater good theodicy, are sufficiently compelling that I am rather persuaded by the intuition, not that God, that the greatest conceivable universe is the one with no suffering at all, no second order goods like courage and altruism, no moral character development, but rather the greatest universe is the one that where there may be a finite period of suffering, but then after that there is a period of ultimate restoration for eternity and infinite bliss and joy for all God's creatures.